Well, welcome. We are thrilled that you have signed on for today's webinar. We have had a tremendous registration response for today's webinar, talking about the administration's proposed change to how they define the official poverty measure here in the United States. So we have folks from all over the country. So again, thank you for being with us. Today is a national partner webinar. We are excited to be doing this in tandem with our colleague organizations CAPLAW, NASCASP, and NCAF. Along with the partnership, the four national organizations believe that this issue is of critical importance for the Community Action Network to be aware of, to respond to, and to help amplify the urgency of response to this issue. We're going to be walking through some technical issues today, although we're going to try to really keep it high level to make sure that we can inform as many people as possible about the core concepts of the administration's proposal. There was a webinar done by CHN last week. It is recorded. We can provide that to you. We're going to reference some of the CHN materials. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities have some really great materials as well that really dive into the minutia. Today we want to talk, though, directly to community action agencies, state CSBG offices, state associations, state weatherization offices, so we can really try to frame the issue and why community action really needs to pay attention. So let's go to the next slide, Liza. So first of all, a really big thank you. We are using materials borrowed from the Coalition on Human Needs and the Center on Budget. Both organizations have been incredibly generous with their expertise and their resources. But I also want to give a shout out to CAPLAW, NASCASP, and NCAF in terms of doing a really big lift on core content. We're going to show you an FAQ, frequently asked questions, that we're going to be distributing to all the organizations on today's webinar, as well as to the broader network, that really tries to drill down to why community action should be paying attention and what you can do to be engaged. So next slide, please. I will also say that on the lower right-hand side of your screen, you do have a spot to put in questions either into the Q&A window or the chat window. We'll pause periodically. We have Liza behind the scenes keeping track of what those questions might be, and we'll do our best to try to answer them. We don't promise to have all the answers on this. Some of this gets really, really technical really quickly, but we'll do our best. We are recording the presentation, and we'll make sure everyone who was registered gets a copy of the recording, the slides, the handouts that we're going to reference. We'll post them up on the partnership's website, and I know CAPLAW and NASCASP will also send this stuff out to all of their mailing lists, as will we in our e-newsletter. And if you don't get our e-newsletters, please let us know. We'd love to be able to add you to that list. So today we are really wanting to talk about the administration's proposal. The registration for today's webinar is significant, so we know people are paying attention. You've heard pieces about this. We know NCAF sent out materials. They've already submitted their letter, which is a great kind of foundation piece for agencies to take a look at to make sure that your comments are in line with what community action is thinking about this proposal. It really is it's an interesting kind of piece. I mean, many of us are in this work due to the advocacy component. I know I am, and the macro change. What's a bit concerning here is that in terms of change agents, having to pay attention to an issue that is about an inflationary measure. And I'll tell you, when we talk about advocacy, we're not always thinking about having to add comment on an inflationary measure. And it seems very economic driven from an economics course, and it is. But it is critically important for community action because you are the experts on serving people in poverty. And what we also know are folks who are technically living above that poverty line struggle. Even CSBG, right, goes a little bit above to 125% of poverty in most places. So whether it's 150% or 175%, we know families struggle at all levels. And so seeing this change in an inflationary measure is very disconcerting. I will add that a piece that was on the CHN webinar that is also a bit concerning. You'll see here says it's in the Federal Register, but it's a request for comment from OMB. It is different than a proposed rulemaking. For instance, whether it was around Head Start or the public charge, many of us are used to, you really want to ramp up the number of comments because if it's a notice of proposed rulemaking, mass matters. Now in this scenario, numbers of comments also matter. But it's a different kind of comment period, which is a bit scarier a little bit too, because in essence, they don't have to put it out for full comment. And I know Veronica and Eleanor may get a little bit into that. I know this is a little bit technical, but it demonstrates the urgency to this matter. We may not have another bite at the apple to make our voices heard on this issue. The other challenge, I think, is really flying below the radar. We heard a bump when it first came out, but you're not hearing a lot about it. So we're really going to need to add the community action voice. So let's go to the next slide. So what is the proposal that the administration is considering? First, OMB's notice seeks comment on changing how the poverty thresholds are updated each year for inflation. Instead of using the standard consumer price index, they are proposing several different options, one of which is a particular concern and that we are really focusing our efforts on. It's called the chained CPI. So instead of inflation raising a poverty threshold from 20,000 to 21,000, as it may, given the current consumer price index, if you reduce and squish those thresholds a little bit, it may only raise it from 20,000 to 20,500. Now that may not seem like a big difference in the first year, but the challenge is over 10 years, and we'll show you some research the Center on Budget has done, it adds up to millions of people losing benefits over time. So the end result is that over time there would be lower poverty thresholds, and that gap gets bigger every year. And once it's set, it just exponentially grows over time. And again, we're talking about the poverty thresholds set by OMB. This, when we talk about the 125 or 133 or 150% of poverty, those are called the HHS poverty guidelines, which are set separately, but based on what that annual poverty threshold is set. So they do tie with one another. So we know CSBG, 125%, Head Start at 100%. And it also applies to entitlement programs like SNAP, WIC, but non-entitlement programs like Head Start, CSBG. Those pieces, once the money's gone, you don't always have, even if it's not an entitlement program, it's still going to apply. So let's go to the next slide. And you can see here, it really, the proposal to lower the federal poverty line would lower eligibility. And I've said this to other groups that I've talked about this proposal to, is that community action agencies are probably the most well-attuned group to what those thresholds do. We already know, and I think all of us agree, that the current poverty threshold is artificially low. Just because a family of 4 makes $26,000 a year does not mean they are no longer poor. We also know there's research such as the self-sufficiency standard, ALICE through the United Way. You know, there are different measures that talk about what it takes for a family to truly be not even self-sufficient, but somewhat economically secure. So oftentimes we talk about a 200% of the federal poverty line is really that kind of point in time where if you're above, you're doing better, but if you're falling below 200%, we sometimes even call that near poor and are really struggling. So we know it's an artificial threshold to begin with, and if you even depress it even further, over time it's going to be a significant, again, loss. You'll see here a number of programs that would be impacted over time through this change. The Medicare Low-Income Subsidy Program, Medicaid programs, Child Health Plus, family planning, tax credits for the the Affordable Care Act, folks participating in the Affordable Care Act programs, cost sharing, SNAP, school breakfast, but again, LIHEAP, CSBG, Head Start, all the programs we deeply care about and know the stories that impact families. The cliff effect, we already know, plays a significant impact on a family. If they take an additional 25 cents an hour or 50 cents an hour in wages, what do they lose because they fall below this artificial threshold? It's already a significant issue. Next slide, please. So here's the research that's been done by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. You can see here that within 10 years, more than 250,000 seniors and people with disabilities would lose or get less help paying for their prescription drugs. More than 300 kids would lose their Medicaid or CHIP coverage. More than 250,000 adults would lose coverage through Medicaid expansion. And again, more than 150,000 marketplace consumers would lose some of that cost-sharing subsidy pieces to help them access health care. I know Center on Budget has just released this research and talking points that can help guide and frame some of your arguments. Next slide, please. So again, we've kind of talked about these pieces, and the administration is claiming in their notice for comment that this would improve accuracy. We know that that's not true. We know that the current poverty measure and its current inflationary growth over time does not in any way clearly define what it takes to make it in this country. So even if you begin to narrow and squish, I think is the technical term I've been using, to kind of squish those inflationary measures over time, even fewer people are going to be defined as poor, and you cannot redefine people out of poverty. We should be focusing our energies on finding solutions for families to help them move up the economic ladder and toward economic security. And you can see here that, again, things that you aren't surprised by. Research have identified a range of problems that make the poverty line currently too low. And again, that the chain CPI, this gets a bit technical, is perhaps really not a more accurate measure for inflation for low-income people. And it notes here specifically because of housing costs. We all know in community action that housing, unaffordability of housing, is a critical issue. And so many CAP agencies are getting into housing development, actually building their own housing, managing their own housing, because there just is not enough affordable housing for families. And we know it says here also that several studies have found that low-income households have experienced even higher inflation than others in recent years. So if you dive into the details about a chain CPI, you'll see the arguments made really are hollow when you look at what a low-income family is, the decisions they have to make about what goods they consume. We all need food. We all need shelter. We all need energy. We all need education. We need transportation. So no surprise to anyone on this webinar here today or in the network, states, agencies, associations. How can you get involved? I'm going to turn the ball over here to Veronica and Eleanor from CapLaw, and they're going to walk us through additional details on this proposal. Veronica and Eleanor, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll move to the CapLaw section.
Thanks, Denise. This is Eleanor Evans, Executive Director of CapLaw, here with Veronica Singh, our Assistant Counsel. So what can we do? Well, in case you haven't gathered by now, we're urging everyone to submit comments on this proposal. And in addition to letting the administration know what your position is and how this could impact people in our communities, we want to make sure that this doesn't fly under the radar as a really technical change that the administration is proposing. We want to make sure that we're drawing attention to this issue and also making sure that we're getting on the record issues that the administration needs to consider before making any changes on this issue. And just under what is called the Federal Administrative Procedure Act, when the administration takes certain actions, they can be challenged in court on the basis that they were done in an arbitrary and capricious way. And so what we want to do is get comments out there, and that if the administration doesn't consider them, there could be a claim that this action was arbitrary and capricious. So as noted, NCAF has submitted comments, and we're sharing those with you if you haven't already seen them, that you can use in drafting your own comments. And then the national partners are also working to develop comments that CAAs and state associations and states and others in the network can use to submit a comment by the due date. And we will be emailing those out to folks who've registered for this webinar, as well as putting them on each of the national partners' websites and in sending them out in our respective e-news. So I'll turn it over to Veronica for further elucidation.
Great, thanks, Eleanor. I just wanted to address one of the questions that came in the chat window, which is to clarify that this proposal would affect CSBG, LIHEAP, weatherization, and Head Start. And the answer is yes. So if you think about eligibility for those programs, as well as many other programs that your agencies may operate, so taking CSBG as an example, many states provide that CSBG income eligibility is 125% of the federal poverty line. And the federal poverty line that they're referring to there is the HHS poverty guideline, which is different from what OMB is proposing to modify. The OMB proposal would change what's known as the official poverty measure. However, the HHS poverty guidelines are derived from those official poverty measures. And so any change that OMB makes to how it derives the official poverty measure would impact the HHS poverty guidelines, which would then impact eligibility for the programs that depend on that guideline. And so that would include CSBG. It would include Head Start, which is 100% of the federal poverty line. And what that means is that the increase of the federal poverty line from this year to next year, and then in all subsequent years, would grow slower over time. So Denise mentioned that instead of the federal poverty line rising from 20,000 to 21,000 in 1 year, it may only rise to 20,500 the next year. And so this is really a far-reaching rule that I think many people have been describing this notice as a sneak attack because it feels that way. It feels like a technical modification. As Denise mentioned, OMB is not even asking for comments on a proposed rule. All it's asking for is for comments on the different inflationary indices and to comment on the relative strengths and weaknesses of those indices. And so it's framed really as this very technical measure that I think can cause people to think this is not important or it doesn't affect them, when in reality, OMB could turn around and adopt one of these alternative measures, which would cause the inflation index to slow over time, which would then reduce eligibility for the programs that community action agencies operate. And so let's go into the next slide and we'll talk about how to frame your comment. So as we mentioned, comments are due Friday, June 21st, and so we have just a few weeks to submit these comments. The question comes up, what will OMB do with all of these comments that it received? As we said, they're not actually proposing any particular index to use. Instead, it's focused on a couple of different possibilities, but many have noticed that OMB is focused on this index called change CPI, which would grow slower than the current inflationary index, and again, would reduce eligibility for the programs. And so we're not sure exactly what OMB will do with all the comments it receives because it hasn't actually proposed which index to use. Many of us are familiar with the general rulemaking process, which is that an agency has to propose a rule, it has to solicit public input and comment, and then when it issues a final rule, it has to show that it's considered all unique comments and respond to those comments when proposing a final rule. And so here, OMB isn't proposing a switch, it's just asking for, strengths and weaknesses of a few different options, but there seems to be authority for the OMB to go forward with these comments and potentially issue a final rule without soliciting input from the public on, the particular inflationary measure they've chosen. And so, as Denise mentioned, we may not get another bite at the apple, which is why it's important to speak up at this point in the process. So what should you think about when you're submitting a comment? So first, if you read the notice, OMB is asking for comments on the technical merits of the different inflationary indices. So asking for comments on the current CPI-U measure and also on strengths and weaknesses of other alternatives. We're not asking you to spend the next few weeks learning about change CPI and these other inflationary measures, and I don't think that anyone should spend a lot of time diving into the technical issues, but I think all of us can think of reasons why the poverty line already falls below what people need to raise a family, taking into consideration that the official poverty measure does not take into account the cost of childcare, housing costs, and so lowering it further would not make it more accurate. It would just make it so that fewer people are defined to be poor even though they're struggling. And so these are the kinds of arguments and issues that are really important to highlight and would be good to raise in your comments. And I think the second piece is that for many of us, our primary focus is on programmatic consequences and how this rule will impact the programs and people that you serve. It's important to frame these comments in a certain way. Again, the notice that OMB published specified that it's not seeking comment on how this proposal would affect the poverty guidelines that HHS develops. And those are the guidelines, again, that determine eligibility in programs like CSBG and Head Start and weatherization and LIHEAP. And so this really shows that OMB is considering making a change that would affect millions of people without really considering the impact on these programs. And so because OMB has specifically said we're not soliciting comments on the programmatic impacts of this rule, we want to frame the comment as saying, if OMB were to consider changing the guidelines, it would be important for OMB to consider effects on programs such as Head Start and weatherization and LIHEAP. Before OMB publishes a final rule, it should be soliciting feedback and looking at studies that show how many people would lose eligibility because of the change in this rule, the impact that that type of assistance has on people's lives in providing stability, and how that impact would grow over time. Essentially, all of the those numbers that Denise shared earlier from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, showing the numbers of people that would lose services, that's the kind of research that OMB needs to do before issuing a final rule. We want to say that in our comments to say OMB really should be taking the time to do that kind of research before determining which inflationary measure to use. We can go on to the next slide. So comments are a part of what we have here as a three-pronged strategy, and getting comments from a diverse group of stakeholders is really important. But there are other parts of the strategy as well. And as Denise mentioned, one of the biggest challenges to this rule or this proposal is that not many people are paying attention to it. It doesn't have the same kind of, I think, immediate appeal, or it's not easy to understand in the way that maybe the public charge rule was easier to understand and how it affected immigrant families if you're paying attention to that in the fall. And so it really can fly under the radar, and it seems from speaking and hearing from other organizations that are leading this effort that many legislators and key policymakers in Washington are also unfamiliar with the impact of the rule. And so it's important to think about how we, raise the public awareness of this issue, and that can include in your local and regional media, whether it's having, folks who are right on that cusp of the poverty line and qualifying for some of the programs that you receive, write op-eds or speak to the media about how this would impact their lives if they were to no longer qualify for services like Head Start. But also engaging and educating key policymakers. So that means that it could be speaking to your representatives in Congress. I think Congress is currently on a recess, and so if members of Congress are back in their home districts, calling their offices and asking if they've heard about this proposal, and if not, showing them some of the materials that have been developed by Coalition on Human Needs and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to show the numbers of folks who would lose services under this proposal. So if you have, members of Congress that you can speak to, this is an opportunity to raise this issue, and that really could be one of the most effective things that we do. Members of Congress are not bound by the June 21st comment deadline date, so they can submit comments to OMB after that date, but they could also do things like issue public statements or even request information about the impact of this policy change. Again, a lot of this is seeking to try to get OMB to slow down and either issue a proposal that the public can then actually weigh in on and evaluate the potential impacts on cuts to eligibility, and delaying the change if there is to be a change. We can go on to the next slide. And so how some of the resources that we just want to provide to the network. We mentioned that there will be some template comments coming from the national partners, so stay tuned to your emails and our websites for that. The Coalition on Human Needs has already released a guide on crafting detailed and high-quality comments. We've provided the link here in the slides. One of the nice things, and we'll cover this guide in the next slide so you have a sense of what it covers, but it does have some sample language that you can copy and paste into a comment letter that you craft yourself. And then lastly, we would encourage folks who do submit comments to send NCAF a copy. That really just helps NCAF coordinate the outreach efforts on the Hill. So if you've sent that comment, then NCAF might coordinate and reach out to your representative just to let them know that the Community Action Agency in their district has submitted comments and weighed in on this issue.
And also you might, we recommend that you submit your comments to your members of Congress directly as well.
That's right, and so that's part of the outreach to your legislators and it's raising the issue for them. And so we'll look at the next slide, which is just looking at this Coalition on Human Needs guide. So as I mentioned, this guide has some sample language that addresses programs that community action agencies operate. So it has language on Head Start, on LIHEAP, on weatherization, on WIOA youth training programs, on SNAP, as well as a number of other programs that your clients may be receiving services from, and so including Medicaid and CHIP, some Affordable Care Act programs, school meals. So I think the recommendation for structuring your comment is to really begin with information about who you are and why you're submitting this comment. So if you're an expert in the field, or if you're someone who would be affected by a change in how poverty is measured, introducing yourselves. The second part is to make arguments about how this proposal would impact some of the programs that you operate. Again, urging OMB to consider doing further research to understand those impacts, but also just to elaborate based on your own experience operating programs. And then lastly is to put in arguments about the different inflation measures. Again, there's sample text in this guide that talks about why change CPI is not necessarily the most accurate measure of poverty. You saw in an earlier slide that there is research showing that low-income families do experience inflation at a higher rate than the change CPI index shows. And so squishing the inflationary index, so going from the current to change, or even to other measures that are even more slower growing, that it may not affect low-income families in the same ways because they just may not have as many substitution options as someone who just has more options available to them. So this guide, again, the link here is at the bottom of the screen. You can download that, and we'll be incorporating some of these arguments into the partners' template comments as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Janae at NASCAS.
Thank you. So we really did want to have this webinar because, as Denise, Eleanor, and Veronica have said, this is a critical time for our network. And if we go to the next slide, it is critical that as community action stakeholders at the state offices, at the state associations, and at the local agencies, this is our call to action. As Denise said earlier, we are uniquely situated to know the impacts of all of the different programs that are going to be affected. So we are the experts. We need to be commenting on this. So we need your voices to submit these letters. And as we are talking about this measure and all of the intricacies of this, what we want to do to support you all as your national associations is to really break it down into easy to digest language for you to use. So that's why we wanted to provide the CHN language, but also these template letters. It's important that we don't just see the same letter over and over again. We want you to add your own unique story from your local area, from your state area as well. So we're going to, in our templates, be able to give you guidance. I want to reiterate what Eleanor and Veronica says. You don't have to become statistician experts on this. That's what they're not looking for. What they are looking to hear is, what are the effects? And so what we're saying is they need to have further research on the programmatic impacts of this, that this change doesn't just affect the families, but what are the program changes that have to occur. So all of those listed here should be submitting. And from the NASCAS perspective, we are working on a letter from NASCAS. We don't have our template done yet. We're very close to it. So you've seen the NCAS letter that's been submitted. You've seen the partnership letter. We'll have a NASCAS letter as well. But state offices for CSBG and weatherization offices can submit. We know that we have governor's offices that are reaching out to our state CSBG and weatherization offices that want to submit on behalf of the governor's offices as well. So don't think that if you're a state office, you're prohibited from submitting. If you have any questions about that, reach out to us and we can let you know what questions to ask within your state office and even match you up to your peers about that. On the next slide, we talked about what the process is. We have a hyperlink here about where to actually submit it on regulations.gov. When you click on this, it talks about filling in your information. It does allow you to enter in your name and your organization. We want Community Action CSBG to be well represented. This is actually a really great opportunity for us to get our name out there in the forefront once again as being poverty experts and being one of the most powerful networks out there to be the first responders when people are making these changes and being the ones to be asked about when they're going to move forward on these issues, to say, okay, now we want to do this further research. We want to go to you about what this impact is going to be about. It does also offer the ability to do anonymous, but we really do want you to be able to put out that this is community action, this is the state offices responding. And then I think we have time for questions as well. There was a question that came through the chat that said, when are the national partner template letters going to be available for the network? Very soon, very early June. We're working on some of the language that we want to, as again, we want to give you different options that you can utilize so that you can cut and paste. We have the CHN options out there as well, but we also want to give you some other guidance that you can have. So I would say the first and second week of June, knowing that June is at the end of this week.
Thanks, Janae, Veronica, and Eleanor. Yes, hopefully early June will be the time when we really push the information out, and as you heard, comments are due on the 21st, so that does give you time. You have NCAP's comments currently as well that you can reference, as well as the CHN guide. We've been answering some of the questions in the Q&A window, but we can walk through some of them. But one just came in asking, is there a particular congressional committee that would review this proposal? I'm wondering if our representatives serve on it. I think one of the interesting aspects that I heard on the CHN webinar was that, in essence, the way OMB and the administration is doing this, they are in essence going around Congress. So currently there is no congressional committee on this specific proposal. Historically, my understanding is these kind of regulatory changes that would be done this way would be done when Congress passes a new law and there's some technical issues that need to be adjusted. OMB would go through this process to make the technical adjustments to allow the law that Congress passed, again, Congress is elected by the people, to go forward. This is kind of circumventing Congress. They're making a regulatory change, proposed change, to regulations outside of Congress. And you heard Veronica and Janae talk about letting your member of Congress know about this. that is incredibly important. They are hopefully getting the advocates in D.C. are working to get the word out to Congress, but they're in their home districts coming up. So whatever you can do to inform them that this is an issue. And I'll just echo Janae's comment. On community action, we've talked a lot about wanting to move much more into the advocacy space. And I know writing a letter about inflationary measures or calling your member of Congress about inflationary measure isn't necessarily the most fun advocacy thing that you get to do. But this is a spot where community action is an expert. It's about defining poverty, and you have credibility like no other. So in making sure your members of Congress know that this is an issue to help raise the flag of concern. So there is no, as far as I understand, no particular committee that would review this proposal because it's in essence designed to go around Congress. Other comments that have come in through the chat include, we talked a bit about, does this really include CSBG, LIHEAP, weatherization, all those sorts of things, and as Veronica explained, yes, it does. Anything that is tied to really one of those thresholds. Again, those HHS guidelines would be impacted most likely if HHS takes those threshold definitions from OMB, as they do all the time to define their thresholds, or the guidelines, excuse me, that would be the case. We talked about when comments would be out. And someone also did post, they checked on regulations.gov, and the numbers of people who are submitting have increased in the last week. It jumped from 75 to 185. So people are responding, and we're hoping that after these couple of weeks, after today's webinar, after we get our tools out, those numbers really jack up with community action being involved. Eleanor and Veronica, anything that has come to your mind that you kind of said, boy, I wish I would have shared that before we go to another question?
Denise, maybe just to weigh in on the question about a congressional committee reviewing this potential. So just to maybe clarify that this is what OMB is asking for is comments on a directive that is an internal directive that applies to how OMB tells the Census Bureau to calculate the official poverty measure. And that's why Congress isn't involved at this point. I mean, presumably Congress could pass a statute that, mandates using a particular inflationary measure. Whether or not that's likely to happen, we can't say for sure. But I would say one other thing to think about is to think about which of your senators and representatives are in committees that work with populations that might be affected by this change. And so, for example, CHN identified on their webinar that Susan Collins is the chair of the Senate Aging Committee. And so, the elderly population and programs that serve the elderly would clearly be affected by this change. And so if you have expertise in those areas, you could be sharing your information and any analysis that you may have done, with her in terms of, folks who are right on the cusp of meeting eligibility guidelines and would lose eligibility, just to make sure that she's thinking about the proposal. So again, even though Congress isn't directly involved in reviewing the comments, because that's OMB's job, it doesn't mean that they don't have influence over OMB.
That's a good point, being strategic in your congressional outreach, for instance. A question did come in about the length of comments. Is there any guidance? My only suggestion would be it's about quality of the comment, I think, is going to be critical. I'm not saying, submit a tome of comments, but I think as much as you can be concise and direct in your concerns is better. Veronica, Janae, Eleanor, things that you'd want to add to that guidance?
No, that sounds right.
I would say clear, concise, 2 to 3 pages tops.
Clear, concise, and 2 to 3 pages tops. Signatures, I agree with Janae. When you're on the regulations.gov website, making sure that you're putting in your name and your agency's name. This is something that you're making comment on. You are the experts. Remaining anonymous, you can do that, but again, I think community action needs to be heard, so I hope that you'll make yourself known. Liza, I think we've answered pretty much all of the questions. Are there any others?
There are a few that came in. One is, what happens after the comments are submitted? What is the OMB's next step?
So that's, I think, a big question mark right now. I think many in the network are fearing this possibility, which is that OMB will go ahead and issue a notice in the Federal Register, saying that they've received the comments and have chosen one of these other alternative inflationary measures without going through another proposal to say, we're proposing, after receiving all these comments on the different options, to go with change CPI, and so asking for public comment on that particular inflationary index. I think it's not clear what OMB will do. This is because it's not a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is what we typically see when it comes to issuing regulations, federal agencies issuing regulations. Those processes are much better defined and have clear, challenges, court challenges that have then shaped the process. And so for those, agencies are required to consider every unique comment and respond to those comments when issuing a final rule. In this case, we're not really sure what could happen, and I think what other organizations who've been working on this campaign have, suggested is that OMB could turn around and write a new directive that essentially says we're choosing to use change CPI in place of the current inflationary measure.
Great, thank you. Liza, is there another question?
A number of questions. So the next is, have the guidelines been changed in the past other than your yearly adjustments, and is there any pattern if they have been changed in the past?
We can answer that question too. So no, the current inflationary measure, and it's called Consumer Price Index for All Urban Consumers, abbreviated CPI-U. That's the inflationary measure that has been used since 1978. And that was issued, or the decision to use the current CPI-U was issued in a policy directive from OMB in May 1978. So since then, there have been no adjustments to the type of inflationary measure used. Of course, that inflationary measure is determined year by year, and it's a complicated, math problem essentially to figure out the cost of goods in this year versus the cost of goods next year, so it is adjusted year to year, but the way that they're calculating it has not changed.
And Liza, after you read the next question, why don't you go ahead and share the FAQ that CAPLA has put together? But let's put the next question on the table.
Sure thing. Just a straightforward question. Is it appropriate to mention community action in individual comments?
This is Denise. From my perspective, it is. You're part of a network of 1,000 local agencies, 50-plus state offices, a network of 40-plus state associations, just touching the lives of 15 million people every year, and 6 million families. You're part of a network that is the national expert when it comes to poverty at a local level. You have your fingers on the pulse of local needs through needs assessments, through your strategic plans, through your tripartite board. I think saying that you're a community action agency and why that matters amplifies and adds validity to your responses. I don't know if CAPLA or NASCASP has anything to add to that.
I 100% agree. That's why I said this is an opportunity for us to get our name out there and say that we are experts in this field, and this is why we're important to be part of the conversation and help drive the conversation.
And on the screen right now, you'll see the FAQ. It's a quick 3-question FAQ that really gets to the heart of the matter, and we will make sure that this gets sent out along with the slides and the recording from today's webinar. Liza, is there another question?
Yeah, there was a question saying, asking if the number of impacted individuals, if that's divided by the states, which I think might be answered in that FAQ, not directly, but indirectly, but I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that.
I don't believe, I think the numbers that were shown in the slides were from a Center on Budget Policy Priorities research paper that was just recently released that was looking specifically at the impact on health programs. I think they do talk about the methodology in the footnotes, so you could look at that. It's actually linked. So this FAQ at the very end, there's a section on additional resources, and it has a number of articles that have been written about this particular issue, one of which is the CBP report. That is not broken out by state, so those would be overall national numbers. And I think that on the CHN webinar, there were questions about whether or not we could have state by state either resources to show the numbers. I think unfortunately, given the tight time frame for submitting comments and really the kind of it's very unclear how this change would actually affect, because OMB is not proposing a specific inflationary measure to use. We just know that the measures that they're proposing are all lower or result in lower poverty thresholds than the current measure, and so it's hard to know for sure how many people would be impacted.
Someone has put a question in, do you have any suggestions for social media strategy around this? And there was just a Twitter storm yesterday run by CHN, and we knew we had this webinar coming up. We wanted to make sure people were more aware of the issue. Odds are there'll be another Twitter storm as we get closer to comment day, would be my guess. I would argue, though, that if you have a Twitter account, if you tag your elected member of Congress, that's a great way to tie, you could share your annual report, share a factoid of your organization about the numbers of people that you serve, and hey, Congresswoman X or Senator Y, did you know that OMB is proposing this? Link. Here's a link to our annual report to show the value of yada, yada, yada. So I think you could use social media by tagging your elected members of Congress, because they themselves may not see it, although that has changed. Certainly their staff see it. Liza, any other questions on your side? I have another one here, but.
No more questions. I was just a comment actually from Eric at NASCAP, just sort of adding on to being strategic about reaching out to your congressman about the issues, was pointing out that that reaching out to members of the Health, Education, and Labor Committee might also be strategic, because that is the committee that oversees the SPG. So any members that are on that committee might be particularly open to hearing comments.
Good. Yep. Strategy when it comes to which members of Congress to reach out to. I'm just going to read this comment here, because it does get a bit technical, but it may be helpful for other folks to kind of do some Googling. Congressional Quarterly says moving to a chain CPI has been, quote, a staple of past efforts to reduce the deficit, unquote. They define it as factoring consumer substitution. For example, pork prices go up, so people buy chicken instead. And I think that goes to one of the core reasons why this is an ineffective measure when it comes to poverty. Our folks aren't probably eating pork or chicken in a lot of situations. They're already substituting for the lowest possible denominator already. And she goes on to say the substitution keeps the inflation for the overall basket of goods lower, they say. She said that was helpful because she's not an economist. So thank you for sharing that. And what I found was the Talk Poverty piece that I think we sent out on our e-news, and NCAF may have sent it out in their e-newsletter as well. I found the Talk Poverty description incredibly helpful in terms of breaking it down to a laywoman's viewpoint on how to understand this particular issue. There's also a question here, is there any connection between this and the reauthorization of CSBG that we could use? That would probably be an NCAF question. I don't know, Eleanor, Veronica, Janae, if you have thoughts on that.
There's no direct connection other than that this change, if it were to be implemented, will reduce the number of folks eligible for CSBG and many other programs. And NCAF had wanted to be on the webinar today, but was not able to due to schedule conflicts, but they are a key partner in this effort, and that's evidenced by the comments that they've submitted already. But if folks have questions about approaching members of Congress or particular committees, that those questions would be well addressed to NCAP.
Good point. Yep. Comment has come in that just some oops, I just lost it. Where did it go? Just wanting to get some clarification. Do you think some congressional representatives don't know about this? We do believe there are many members of Congress who do not know about this. They have a lot on their plate. This is really flying under the radar. And the way it's framed, it's made to sound like just this little technical issue over here. Don't pay any attention to the man behind the mirror or behind the curtain. It is not being well publicized. It's not necessarily being framed. So yes, it says, if so, should our message be this is happening without including you? That seems like a message to perhaps send. Hey, did you know this is going on? Congress should be involved as the people's representative. And if we're going to redefine people out of poverty, to get their attention, you need to pay attention to this Congresswoman X, Senator Y, to this issue. Let's see. Other questions that have come in?
No, on my end that I can see.
Comment, FYI, House Government Reform and Oversight Committee has jurisdiction over the Census Bureau and related issues. It has responsibility for oversight. So House Government Reform and Oversight Committee. So perhaps we can take a look at that committee to see if any of your members sit on that. Follow up on the social media. So those of us in very conservative states, we should probably lean toward they're doing this without you. I'm not sure what the messaging is from a national advocate perspective on that. It seems to make some sense that you want to. I'm not sure what their response would be. You'd have to judge whether or not that they would be supportive or not, I guess, right? Of the issue. But they are doing it without them, and the idea is that it really needs congressional input, and it needs public comment, and it needs to go to the next step of a formal notice of proposed rulemaking. Let's see. Another question, so could we start with the folks who introduced the CSBG reauthorization? We already know they are friendly to us. There are many congressional members who know that this is happening. I'm not sure how broad that is. I'm hoping that the reauthorization folks know that this is happening, but certainly if those are your congressional members, I would definitely reach out to them since they are probably the most attuned to community action, the most attuned to poverty at the moment, given CSBG. One clarification, the name of the committee is House Oversight and Reform, in case you are going to the Google machine to find that out. House Oversight and Reform. All right. Thank you so much for everyone putting the stuff in the windows. That's fantastic. It always is best to reframe to your questions. So I think we hit them all. Anything else coming on your side, Liza?
Yes, one more. On the state level, there are many hoops to jump through to get comments submitted. Will the NASCAS template help those of us that would face that issue?
I think I got your last part, but there was a siren that was drowning you out.
I'm still muted because the siren's still going by, so I'll just try and speak louder, actually. On the state level, there are many hoops to jump through to get comments submitted. Will the NASCAS template help those of us that would face that issue?
Yes, our template's going to help walk through those states. We may not be able to break through all the barriers, but we will be representing all the states. And as I said before, we're able to connect you up with your other state peers who are able to submit comments, and that can help break through some of your state barriers for other state governments to say, listen, Oregon, Oklahoma was able to do this, and this is why it's important. So absolutely reach out to us. We know all of the tips to be able to break through that red tape. And Eric Bena, who is on the line, he is the lead on working on this with us at NASCAS.
Great. I think that is all of the questions that have come in. We will be sharing recording, the handouts, and the CHN guide as well with folks who have registered for today's webinar, and most everybody stuck with us through all the Q&A, so thank you for that. Well, with that, we are ending today's webinar, but happy Community Action Month. You have a couple more days to share your tweets, your posts, your proclamations. I hope that you'll do that. And thank you for being engaged in today's conversation. Today's webinar is about advocacy. And to have so many agencies be engaged is really great to see. And thank you for your interest. We'll get our materials out, and please submit comments. So thank you again for being with us here today. We'll close out and have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.